For me, it's not particularly hard to still have God deeply in my life. The challenge is more Zionism. October 7th was the failure of Israeli sovereignty and the basic Zionist premise. A pogrom happened in Israel.
Welcome to What Came After. I'm your host, Manya Marcus. On What Came After, we'll take a look at the many ways that people's lives changed on and after the brutal massacre in Israel on October 7th, 2023. We'll be speaking with people in Israel and around the world about how the devastating attack by Hamas has shifted, shaped, and changed them. To learn more about our podcast, please visit us at whatcameafter.com. Thank you so much for joining us. I am here with Rabbi Joe Wolfson. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up in Israel.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Great to be here. I'm from the UK originally, grew up in London, went through the UK Jewish world, very involved in B'nai Akiva, and then spent my time studying in Israel, first as a gap year at Shivat Har Etzion, also known as Gush. That was really my Israel immersion. I did my degrees in the UK, mainly in political philosophy at Cambridge and then at UCL. And it was actually my university experience more than anything else which really made me think seriously about Jewish community and Jewish leadership as the career path that I might want to follow. And I finished smicha, my rabbinic studies, in 2015 in Israel. We were living here at the time, my wife Karine and I. And then we decided to have an adventure, and we spent 7 years in New York. I was what's known as the JLIC Rabbi at NYU in downtown Manhattan. And those were 7 very, very wonderful years where we fell deeply in love with the work and with the neighborhood, and we had many hundreds of students over that time. And I think that experience really opened up the possibilities for me of what a creative rabbinic career could be. I like communities, I like cities, I like building communities in cities. And that was really sort of the model that we developed. We had lived in Israel for a good amount of time before we'd come to New York. My wife's family have very deep roots in Israel. Her family have been in Tel Aviv since the early 1930s. And we wanted to move back and received wonderful support from our employers in America to start a program in Tel Aviv, working primarily initially with recent olim in their 20s and 30s, recent immigrants to Israel. And that was a couple of years ago that we moved back, and it's been a blast since.
So I think that you have a bit of a reputation, I don't know if you're aware of it, as maybe an activist by fire rabbi, meaning that I don't know that you chose to walk the path of an activist, but you were in New York when COVID broke out, and I'm aware that you did a tremendous amount of communal work, not just within the Jewish community, but also beyond it. And now you are here during a war. What has it been like for you to pivot twice to this kind of work, and how would you define it as different than what you were anticipating?
Great question. I do, and I think you as well, Manya. I know you've got a strong COVID activism background. I do think a lot more privately in my head than speaking about it much, so it's nice to have the opportunity to speak about it. I do think a lot about the experience of the last year and living very intensively through this conflict and trying to play a productive role and helping others too as well. I do think of that a lot in light of COVID. COVID, it's weird in Israel, they call it Corona. They never say COVID.
They do say Corona here, yes.
We call it COVID. COVID in Manhattan was, I think, a formative experience for us. This might sound strange and maybe even perverse. Of course, there was so much hardship during those times, including for us. My wife's mother died of cancer in Israel during COVID, and that was very challenging, barely being able to travel at all. We were homeschooling two small children, but despite those difficulties, COVID for us was years of immense growth and I think realization about, ourselves personally, but also professionally, about what can be done in an urban environment with a network and community of a few hundred young people who want to help, who can be well and quickly organized. And that has been a very similar experience here as well. The common ingredients are an urban environment, a major emergency, hundreds of people having a desire to help. And I used the word in New York to describe our word, the word of shadchan. A shadchan is a matchmaker. Normally it refers to romantic matchmaking, but being able to connect people who want to help with people and groups who have needs, and to be able to sort of stand in the center of those is wonderfully empowering. It's probably worth saying, I do try to talk about this, you can only pull off incredible feats in extraordinary times if you've developed a muscle during ordinary times. You can't go from zero to everything just because suddenly there's an emergency. And that's true in all manner of ways. If you run a community, then the community needs to have at the core of its identity that we are a community who are deeply committed to our neighborhood and our city, and we're going to be the people who help when there's need. And there's always need, right? It's not that, take away a war, take away COVID, everybody's happy all the time. There's poverty, there's isolation, there's all manner of issues local to a place or common across places. You need to have built up the connections and the networks. And then once you've got that muscle, then you can use it to great effect when something terrible hits, like COVID or like this war.
As soon as the war started, I'll start by saying that, I keep Shabbat, my family keeps kosher. I had some conversations with direct survivors, and I heard from people who are secular the phrase, thank God, a lot. And I said to them, I feel strange because I'm the observant one, and I feel no need to thank God in this moment. I really am wondering where God is and where he was. So since the beginning, I've wondered how this experience has changed rabbis, people, theologically, spiritually. And I'm curious if you feel that your Judaism, or just what sits in your mind and your heart, is different as a result of the war and this experience and this real tragedy.
Before answering your particular question about me personally, I think it's worth just taking up the preamble of religious concepts hidden away in the language of everyday conversations, including by people who definitely don't think of themselves or describe themselves as religious. And I think part of the goal of your podcast is not just to talk about what came after October 7th, but also to introduce your listeners to parts of Israeli society they might not be familiar with. There's a remarkable religiosity or spirituality which is present in so much of Israeli life and society in a way in which is not the case in the diaspora, not in America, certainly not where I came from in the UK. It's a completely different language. I'll give two examples. In the first weeks after the war, you would hear from plenty of people, how do I talk to God now? What does this mean in this moment? I had someone very dear in our community write to me personally saying, I don't understand at all how I'm supposed to compute God into this. The second Shabbat after October 7th, right? So October 7th was a Shabbat. So October 21st, we had made already many connections in the hotels in Tel Aviv with evacuees from the south. And it was a crazy town at that point. You had tens of thousands of people for whom Tel Aviv is really a foreign city, arriving in such terrible circumstances. And I was asked if I would give a shiur, parsha, a weekly Torah class on a Shabbat afternoon, to a group of grandmothers from Sderot in their 60s and 70s, which is not normally the demographic that I teach. So it was fascinating challenge, what I was going to speak about. But anyway, we got to the hotel and began chatting. And I said to one of them, hearing their stories, I said to one, what's been hardest for you? And of course, you could think of a million things that have been hard. So this was a woman who fled her house on October 7th or October 8th. She said, this has been the first time in my life where I have not done hafrashat challah for 2 weeks. That's the hardest thing for me.
Can you tell people what that mitzvah is? Anyone who doesn't know.
Hafrashat challah literally means a separation of dough when baking bread. The phrase, the name challah for our Shabbat loaves is actually a much later use of the term. The original meaning of challah is the separation of a part of the dough. It's sort of part of the tithing. And this quite technical mitzvah has a huge, perhaps Manya, as a woman, you can describe it better than I can. It has huge sort of totemic significance. There are the Hafrashat Chalot gatherings. It's seen as part of the most almost like intimate fabric of female Jewish spirituality and religiosity. Blessings are made over it. Prayers are said over it. It's part of the real beauty of this non-shul Judaism, the deep integration of Jewish spirituality into the home. This is stuff which is not particularly popular in Ashkenazi communities in North America, but amongst Israeli Jews and certainly amongst Sephardi Israeli Jews, it's a huge thing. So that's what this woman was struggling with. I'll give you another funny example. Jewish religious men who are not Haredi, but just, regular religious folk, are distinguishable by two features. They wear kippot on their heads and they wear tzitzit. You would think, as is certainly the case, fewer would wear tzitzit. Tzitzit are heavier, sweatier, it's a hot environment, or they hide them under their clothes. A kippah is very easy. There is a trend. I thought I was, seeing things at first, but I've seen it enough times. There are a substantial number of men in Tel Aviv who I now see who do not present as typically religious at all, who wear tzitzit out, who don't wear kippot, right?
That's fascinating.
Now, for those who have a little bit of a sort of, understanding of the street, as it were, like that doesn't fit, right? And what I think that says is there is this remarkable spirituality which expresses itself through Jewish ritual, which is bubbling through in places where one wouldn't expect it. So I say that as part of the background to your question. I think we live between both of those. We live between the question of the guy in my community saying, where is God right now? How do I speak to God right now, on the one hand? And on the other hand, between actually the intensity of this moment, having brought out very profound religious expressions by so many people. Obviously, you can find anything when you look for it. I am not finding accusations thrown at God or hiddenness of God's presence as being a particularly strong theme right now. We're in Slichot season, which are these special prayers which are said in the run-up to Yom Kippur, which traditionally take place at night. We ran an event with our friends from Kiryat Shmona, who are in Tel Aviv, the other night, and the shul was overflowing with residents of Kiryat Shmona pouring their hearts out at Slichot. You see it expressed in a lot of the music. You're kind enough to describe me as an activist. If I'm being honest, we're able to achieve a lot of wonderful things. Part of the drawback or the other side of the coin of sort of having a very action-focused approach is you are less contemplative. Primarily, my mode has been, let's move, let's organize. What can we do? Who needs help? That's massively powerful and important, and I'm so proud of it. It's also in certain ways a way of running away from or hiding away from not theological questions, just bechi, just tears, the devastation of what has taken place. So it's important for somebody like me, and I think a lot of people are like me with this, to try to hew out that time. I want to make one more comment about God in this moment. If I do think about it, October 7th was a far greater challenge to my Zionism than it was to my Judaism. What I mean by that is it didn't take for October 7th for us to discover that God is not an interventionist deity who will always prevent evil happening to others. We have numerous aspects of our history which show that, and we're not naive. If you live Jewish thought, then from, if not the time of the Tanakh, the Bible, then at least from the time of the Talmud, Chazal, the sages, are grappling with how on earth can the temple be destroyed and our people be exiled if this doesn't mean the end of the relationship, the end of the covenant. And so for thousands of years, we've thought deeply about what this means. So for me, it's not particularly hard to still have God deeply in my life because I've got thousands of years of drawing on those for it. The challenge is more Zionism, because traditional Zionism, its basic premise is that Israel will be a place where Jews are safe from persecution, from anti-Semitism. And of course, we know it's nowhere near as simple as that. But October 7th was the failure of Israeli sovereignty and the basic Zionist premise. A pogrom happened in Israel, right? For those of your listeners who are into their Zionist history, one of the great early poems of Zionism by Chaim Nachman Bialik, it's called in English The City of Slaughter, which is about the Kishinev pogrom in 1903. And the basic point of the poem is something needs to change. Something needs to happen. The Jews have lost their humanity if they are not able to look after themselves. And I can't remember the exact number, but this is almost heartbreaking. Something like 43 Jews were killed in Kishinev, right? That's 43, far too many. But how many kibbutzim were there? Were far more than 43 were slaughtered on October 7th. And so Bialik's solution to his problem was revealed on October 7th to not be the solution, or at least not be the solution that we thought it was. So there's much more to say about that, but in terms of my beliefs which were challenged on October 7th, I think it was Zionism more than Judaism.
I want to pivot back to theology just for a second.
Pull me back in.
I'm going to have to think about this failure of Zionism and what came after on that level as well. I want to read something that you wrote to your community in advance of Tisha B'Av. Could you share, while I pull this up, just what Tisha B'Av means on the Jewish calendar for anyone who isn't familiar?
Sure. Tisha B'Av is the darkest day of the Jewish calendar. On its most basic level, it commemorates the destruction of both the first temple in the year 586 before the Common Era, so 2,600 years ago or thereabouts. And also on the very same date, many centuries later, the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans in the year 70 CE. And it has become a kind of template for how Jews think about and remember and mourn and process the terrible, dark chapters of Jewish history. There are multiple other moments in Jewish history which took place on Tisha B'Av, whether it be to do with the Holocaust or the Spanish Inquisition. Yom Kippur is a somber day. Tisha B'Av is a sad day. It's a fast day. It's a day where traditionally kinot, these poems, lamentations, are said. And it was a day in our current moment where Tisha B'Av didn't feel like something historical at a distance we were remembering, but something that we were living through in the moment.
Okay. With that introduction, I'm going to read a portion of what you wrote to your community. It's a beautiful letter, and this is a portion that I found very interesting. You write, "Here is another element that appears to me unique and different this Tisha B'Av. There is a story that is often told on Tisha B'Av of Napoleon passing by a synagogue somewhere in Eastern Europe and hearing Jews crying inside. He asks what they are crying about and is told that it is Tisha B'Av and that they are mourning for their temple that was destroyed 2,000 years ago. And Napoleon is supposedly very impressed by this, about the power of Jewish memory. And perhaps he even says, if they still remember this, then surely they will return to their land. And it's a good story, but at its heart is the claim that Jewish life has become divorced from Jewish history. I have reflected many times since October 7th that we are a generation who feel like we came after. We weren't around at the start of the 20th century for the great debates about the direction that the Jewish people would take. We didn't experience the Shoah or the founding of the State of Israel, not the Six-Day War, and not the battle for Soviet Jewry. So what is left for us to do? What is left for us to fight for? Well, that is no longer. We are a generation and a people that has rediscovered its purpose, that knows that it needs to fight." Okay. Thank you for bearing with me reading your words. I read this, and it almost resonates with me as something that's empirical. There is no denying that Jewish tragedy permeates Jewish history, and that some kind of triumph, some kind of growth comes from that tragedy. The question that I have, though, is, do Jews need tragedy to be Jewish? And since you're pausing, I want to also add, this literally just came to me, reading Heschel when I was younger was so impactful. And I remember reading something where he said, to equate God with history is idolatry. God is present when man's heart is alive. So I'm just going to toss this whole big thing in your direction and say, do we need tragedy? What is the role of history in our relationship with God? Can we get beyond that, perhaps?
I'm a big fan of Heschel. I don't understand that quote in the slightest. Think it's impossible to live and breathe your Judaism without also thinking about Jewish history. It was just last week's parasha, Torah reading, which starts with the bringing of the first fruits to Jerusalem. And an Israelite in the land brings their first fruits to the temple and says, "This is who I am, Arami Oved Avi. My father was a wandering Aramean and went down to Egypt. And there we were oppressed and we cried out and you heard us and you brought us out and you brought us into this land and here I am." And that text becomes the sort of backbone of the Haggadah. And Jewish memory is hardwired into Jewish history. So I don't understand what that quote from Heschel could mean. However, I do not want to fall into what I think is a trap of understanding history as being about tragedy and understanding Jewish identity as being fundamentally taken with that. If you want to look for biblical motifs, there is Mitzrayim and there is Sinai. There is enslavement in Egypt. And shortly after that, there is the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Rav Soloveitchik, contemporary of Heschel and great American Jewish leader and thinker in the 20th century, considered those to be two covenants. There is the covenant of suffering, which binds Jews together. And there is the covenant of destiny, which is about the choices that we make and the world that we decide to build and the commitments that we take upon ourselves. I don't think you can separate them out easily from one another. I don't think you can only choose one or the other. I'm not attracted at all to a version of Jewish identity which says, who am I? I am the person being attacked, and therefore that is what my identity is. I think that's dangerous. I think it cramps us. I think it suffocates us. It doesn't lead to interesting and beautiful creativity. At the same time, sadly, we can't escape it, right? Jews throughout the 20th century have longed to escape it, longed for a Jewish identity completely free of the weight and the heaviness of our history. And you can run as much as you want, but you can't hide from it because it's there. So the question is, what do you do with it and what do you build with it?
So first of all, I'm going to be extremely embarrassed if I've misquoted Heschel. I am sitting here right now remembering myself reading this 25 years ago.
You might not be wrong if we were going to do a little deep dive on Heschel. Heschel was born in Europe. He escaped thanks to the American Reform Movement, which had a special fund for scholars. His mother and sister perished in Treblinka. One brother did survive and became a rabbi in London, but most of the world he knew was destroyed. And one of the remarkable things about Heschel in his work in America from the 50s onwards is that he barely ever speaks about the Holocaust. It's not present really in his writings. So it could be that there is a tendency.
So that's where I see the Holocaust in his writing. If the idea is that we need to not just look at tragedy for our relationship with God, I can imagine that being a fresh concept for him in the wake of the Holocaust. So we'll see. I'm going to look this up. And if I'm wrong, I'm going to start the episode by saying so. Nonetheless, it generated an interesting conversation. I'm basically asking you the same question, but I'm going to ask it to you again with another Heschel quote that I heard the last time I was in my own shul a couple weeks ago. The quote was about how more than Israel keeps Shabbat, Shabbat keeps Israel. And this is my question about the covenant of suffering. Can we have the covenant of destiny without the covenant of suffering? Do we need suffering to keep us? You mentioned in this letter to your congregants, to your community, about how last year, Tisha B'Av, over the judicial reform in Israel, we were tearing each other apart. And it was painful for immigrants who had chosen to be here to see Israel start to kind of internally combust. Now it feels different. And so I'm wondering if this, again, if the covenant of suffering has to keep us, Israel, or if the covenant of destiny can exist without it.
I don't think the covenant of destiny can exist without it. I think there is just a strata of Jewish identity which knows that a part of our history and often a part of our present is that there are those who hate us. I think this is very hard for a lot of people to hear. For me, it was part of a sort of remarkable learning experience when I first moved to America, to see that my students, for the most part, did not identify with that at all. And I came from the UK, and not to misrepresent my upbringing at all, but a certain level of anti-Jewish animosity was present. It wasn't Paris, it wasn't, Warsaw of the 1930s, not in the slightest. But I knew as a 14-year-old kid that I would wear my kippah to school, and I may well get shouted at, and I might get the occasional punch. Nothing worse than that, Jews throughout history would have loved for that to be the level of anti-Semitism that they received. But it becomes a part of who you are. And it was remarkable for me meeting my students in New York who really thought of themselves as uncomplicatedly white Americans of the Jewish faith. And I say this with real sadness, that that's changed. And that's not changed simply because of Israel. It changed before October 7th. The Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh in 2018 was obviously a major watershed moment, but other ones as well. And so by the time we left New York in 2022, I think our students had gone through some process of their identity becoming a little bit more similar to European Jews of today. Now, it's very important that we don't make this into some sort of ideal. I'm not attracted at all to a Jewish identity which is focused solely on the Shoah, and there are many, many people for whom that is the core of their identity. That can't produce anything positive and powerful in my mind. But it also can't be denied. Why would somebody in their 20s or 30s move to Tel Aviv? The answer they might have given a few years ago is beaches, great high-tech scene, beautiful people, and kosher food as well, right? And fun shuls where there are lots of people to socialize with. What's not to like? And it has been a hard realization that, in the words of an ancient Talmudic phrase, Ein Eretz Yisrael niknet ela b'yisurin. The land of Israel is only acquired through struggle and through suffering, really, is what that word means. In other words, we want to build beautiful, fantastic, vibrant Jewish lives. And we've got the tools for it, and they are creative, and they draw on our tradition, and they are committed to our tradition, and they are new, and they are innovative. But at the same time, that doesn't exist in pure isolation from the harsh realities. And so in that way, the experience of the last year or the last few years, depending where you date it, I think brings us more into line with previous generations. Look at my bookshelf over there. Your listeners can't see it. There's half a bookshelf of Yiddish literature. I really like Yiddish short stories. Yud Lamed Peretz, Lamed Shapiro, Shalom Aleichem. Those guys were the superstars of the Jewish world 100 years ago. They were the opinion makers. They were the most widely read, and they write beautiful, creative stories. But they're doing it within the context of terrible experiences that European Jewry is going through. So I just picked that only as one example, and there are dozens of other examples of where beautiful, powerful contributions to what the positive version of Judaism exists alongside, embedded into, going through really, really hard things.
We're talking about olim. You work with new immigrants. Let me ask you a question. Maybe you can solve this. What's the word machlochet?
Argument.
This argument in my marriage. My husband very strongly believes that Israel needs the diaspora. I don't know. Now that you have made Aliyah, I assume you're hoping to stay. What is your opinion? Does Israel need a diaspora?
Yes. Yeah, I'm going to side with your husband.
Thank you.
On that one.
Now I'll leave him alone.
Uncomplicatedly. There might be some listeners who might be surprised to hear me say this. I've never been attracted to the idea that there is only one way and one place of being Jewish. There have always been multiple poles to the Jewish world. In Talmudic times, there was Israel and there was Babylon. There's been the Ashkenazi world and the Sephardi world. Israel needs a diaspora, and the diaspora needs Israel. It's a two-way street. You can make the argument in all manner of ways that it's important for the world outside of Israel to have Jewish communities in it who they know, who they learn from, that Israelis have a version and a model of Jewish identity that they can look at, which survives and flourishes, hopefully under conditions of being a minority. It should be an important relationship where each one cross-pollinates and gives to the other. I'm big on that. I don't like the shlilat hagolah, the rejection of the exile sort of version of Zionism, which was popular for a lot of Zionist history. I think it's crude. I think it cuts out so much of value, which is there. In the same way in which a singer like Yishai Ribo is filling up Madison Square Garden with people who are delighted, overwhelmed at such beautiful and soulful Israeli music, there are contributions which push in the other direction as well.
Now I'm going to pull you in a different direction.
Let's do it.
Thank you for that. There are a lot of incredible leaders that have emerged in this moment. You signed up to be a leader. You signed up to belong to a community. I'm wondering if your family feels that it is difficult to share you with so many others right now.
That's the hardest question so far, definitely. And you should ask my wife, Corrine, as well. It's something that I know I need to be aware of the danger of it. That stuff that is my adrenaline, and there were days when I was working 19, 20 hours primarily on WhatsApp in the early days of the war. My wife, Corrine, she gets that in those moments and she appreciates it. And she's also happy to tell me, need you here now. I'm very, very aware of it myself. And I try to make sure I don't fall too much into it. But of course, you're right. There is a tendency and a potential for people who are very much engaged in the public sphere to forget that those who are closest to them need to be prioritized.
My last question about having a family here now is, we're sitting here, I don't even know the date. What date is it? It's September 24th, 2024. There's a lot going on couple hours north of us. And my question about having your family here now, having the option of being elsewhere, do you feel safe?
Let me answer it like this. Yesterday, between 4 and 6 p.m., I was on the beach where my daughter was having her surfing after school activity, and I was sitting and watching her. That night, last night, I give a class on a Monday night. I think it was the biggest one I've ever given. It's normally 45 to 50 people come on a Monday night. There was upwards of 70 there last night. Something that people from the outside need to understand is that one of the most remarkable elements of Israeli resilience is that Iran can rain down 300 missiles in a night on April the 14th. And the next day, the bars are full and the beach is full and the Beit Midrash is full. And we snap back. And I love that. And that's something amazing to be a part of. Do I feel safe? We live in a scary part of the world. We do. And we live at a particularly scary moment. And I understand somebody who says, I want to only prioritize my family. And of course, we all do want that. But our challenge is that there's nowhere which is perfectly safe right now. And we know we've got a role to do. We've got a part to play. The thing that our enemies least want is for young kids to have a wonderful life here. And that's what we're going to do.
I want to thank you for joining me. You asked for some prep, and I gave you none. And you came on quite a ride. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sing need more than I. There are children that fight to be free. There are mothers that sit and they cry. But the answer came back in the shine of his pretty wife's eyes. Together they sing.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe to What Came After wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us online at whatcameafter.com.